understanding structural and institutional racism. I think we can't talk about structural and institutional racism without looking at, there's quite a few themes that we should be looking at. I want us to think about social capital. So social capital is your network. So famously someone said your network is your net worth. And I think that's completely correct. As we would know, particularly in the creative industry, it is definitely about who you know rather than what you know. And then there's cultural capital. So it's worth me stating we all have cultural capital, irrespective of what class bracket you sit in or the way you've been socialized. So cultural capital is basically gaining access into certain spaces through language, through different codes. So it could be, for instance, knowing how to use cutlery if you're fine dining. It could be knowing how to read a wine list. Though equally, it could be, you know, a particular dialect that is part of a particular demographic or heritage. Cultural capital isn't just reserved for a particular upper class, for instance. Everyone has it. It's an access point. And then there's also intersectionality. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is an African-American race theorist, and she was speaking about it from the lens of being a Black woman, but also being a woman, but also being a Black woman, and how these overlapping identities create structural barriers to gaining access into spaces. Now, this is a great diagram by the Slow Factory Foundation, which is the 4 dimensions of racism. So we've got the institutional, which is policies and practices that reinforce racist standards within a workplace or organisation. And then you've got the structural, which is multiple institutions collectively upholding racist policies and practices, i.e. society. And then you've got the interpersonal, which is, you know, racist acts of microaggressions carried out from one person to another. And then you've got the internalized, which is the subtle and overt messages that reinforce negative beliefs and self-hatred in individuals. So for instance, the internalized could be images that we see in the media. For instance, there's a wonderful piece of work by a British Tanzanian artist, though she's absolutely fantastic. And anyway, what she did was, she went through the Guardian archives over the course of 25 years. And what she found was, through going through the Guardian archives over a period of 25 to 30 years, she found that if there's a very positive story of a Black man or woman or non-binary, there will be a negative one on the same page or the opposite page to counter it. And it's fascinating, but absolutely so saddening to see it. And yes, I definitely encourage you to see that piece. And I think that's a really great example of the internalized, you know, the subliminal messaging in which one receives. Let's talk about privilege, because we can't talk about race relations in this country without talking about privilege. So I want to talk about all the different types of privileges that exist. And going back to that idea of intersectionality, how can all these different privileges or disadvantages be overlapping? And when I say disadvantages, I think it's really important for us to realise that a person isn't disadvantaged. It's the system that has them at a disadvantage. So I think we need to move the onus from the individual. You know, very famously, Dr. Martin Luther King was interviewed back in the 50s, 60s. And the interviewer said, you know, why can't the Black community just pull themselves up by the bootstraps? And then Dr. Martin Luther King very eloquently replied, in order to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that implies that you have boots. You need to have boots in order to be able to do so. So back to that point, what I'm trying to make is, you know, we need to definitely move the onus on the individual to pulling themselves up to actually the system which prevents them from making a life for themselves. You know, it's the system that has people at a disadvantage rather than the individual being disadvantaged. So We've got white privilege, which obviously there's a lot more literacy around this concept now. So I'm going to pass that quickly, but to summarize, it's to have privilege based on your whiteness. And then there's also passing privilege. So for instance, my other heritage is Persian Iranian. So my dad's Persian Iranian, and he looks like the archetypical Italian. So he's got olive skin, jet black hair, deep brown eyes, and he is able to pass into white British society without people realizing that he's not of European ancestry. So that's passing. And then there's proximity to whiteness. So my mother is British Jamaican. She's much darker than I, and she's got a beautiful, rich kind of, almost like Senegalese purplish complexion. And she and I will be received differently. So even though I am black, brown, I identify as both. Because I am a few shades lighter than her, I am able to gain access to certain spaces. Some people might feel more comfortable speaking to me. So that's a privilege that I'm very much aware of, and something that actually my family point out quite a lot to me, which I think is important for me to kind of have that realization. And then there's social and economic privilege. So social privilege is, for me, I don't think we can conflate the social and economic. As we know, social privilege is very different to economic. So, that's why we have terms like nouveau riche in this country. Nouveau riche is new money. So even though you have economic privilege, you'll never be able to gain social access into certain circles. Though also, to flip that, we all have a level of social privilege. So going back to that idea of cultural capital, that's a social privilege in itself. And then there's heteronormative privilege, so cisgendered privilege or heterosexual privilege. So cis literally just means to be of the same. So for me, I was born a woman, and my gender is female. So they relate there. And my sex is still the same. So I have not transitioned into, I'm not a trans man. And then heterosexual privilege is, even though I don't identify myself as straight, I've been in a relationship with a woman. However, at this moment in time, I'm in a relationship with a man. So for instance, if my partner and I, Pete, were to go outside, we wouldn't face any abuse, for instance, or it's very unlikely that we would, based on us being a heterosexual couple. However, we might face abuse based on us being an interracial couple, because Pete is white. Now, there's also gender privilege. As we know, a lot of organisations have a very male-dominated senior leadership. There's also ableist or non-disability privilege. So as we know, a lot of our buildings in this country, in the UK, are listed. Therefore, structurally, there's very little that we can do, though obviously amendments can be made. And I think that's something that needs to be legislated. Not too sure if it has been done. If it has, I'd love someone to kind of drop that into the chat box for us. And then there's religious privilege. So a lot of our religious holidays in the UK, if not all, are situated around Christianity. So, a great way to rectify that is, say, if you have people within your organisation that celebrate Ramadan, how might they be able to swap out one of those holidays? So rather than celebrating Christmas Day, how about they work that day and then use the additional day use that day to celebrate Ramadan? So that's an example of religious privilege. Now, race and ethnicity in this country and class, in my opinion, are inextricable. And I think it's really difficult for us to talk about one without talking about the other. Absolutely, you can be black and be middle class. Though, as we know, there's there's a very large black working class population in this country, as there is a very large white working class population as well in this country. Though, as we know, the middle class is growing. So how did we get here, and what are the origins of racism in the UK? So we can't talk about racism in the UK without looking at colonisation. Colonisation created slavery. Slavery funded the Industrial Revolution, though it's also worth noting, as you probably all know, the working classes in this country also fueled the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution created capitalism, and capitalism created globalization. So you can see there's a chain of events here. I think also we need to talk about eugenics. However, the term eugenics was coined when slavery was already happening, but there are recent coinages of eugenics. However, the actual term hadn't been coined, but there were other ideas around eugenics, from Plato to Darwin. They all spoke about it, but hadn't coined the term as such. So just to give you a brief overview, so the study of or belief in the possibility, so eugenics is the study of or belief in the possibility of improving the qualities of the human species or a human population, especially by such means as discouraging reproduction by persons having genetic defects or presumed to have inheritable undesirable traits, negative eugenics, or encouraging reproduction by persons presumed to have inheritable desirable traits, positive eugenics. So as we know, famously, eugenics was weaponized by Hitler. But I want to just talk about the actual way it was defined by Francis Galton. So Francis Galton was the creator of the field of eugenics, but as I say, Plato as well as Darwin had spoken about it, selective breeding. So in his 1869 work, Galton assembled biographical information from obituaries and other sources and constructed pedigrees of leading English families, concluding that superior intelligence and abilities were inherited with an efficiency of 20%. From this work, he coined the term eugenics, meaning well-born, and theorized that humanity could be improved by encouraging the fittest members of society to have more children. So by reading that or by hearing that, you can definitely see, which kind of reaffirms this idea, you cannot talk about race without talking about class. We cannot do it. For here I can see eugenics is primarily founded on this idea of class, though it has been racialized. And, going back to that idea of thinking about whiteness as a diverse ethnicity, Galton has been very specific. He's looked at English families, therefore making a distinction from other white ethnicities. Now, being white in this country is to be part of the mainstream and is to be part of the dominant culture. And everyone else, unfortunately, sits on the margins. So I would really like to invite you to think about what that might feel like. But also I would invite you to think about the power in which, if you are white, the power in which that you have to really, to use Akhil's language, activism, to really kind of utilize your professional tools to correct the wrongs of this world. So within a racial context, being part of the dominant culture gives you a privilege, and to have privilege is to have power. Now, I want us to look at Dr. Joy Taguri's work once again. So I mentioned her earlier in regards to her incredible work around trauma and the inheritance of trauma. And when I came to her work many years ago, this is an equation that I found that she had created. So power plus prejudice equals an ism. So this is a theory that's been coined by Dr. Joy Taguri, and I invite you once again, to really think about, if you're white in the UK, you are in a position of power because you have a privilege, and if you have a prejudice, whether it be big or small, that becomes an ism. So when we're talking about anti-racism work, or even being a mentor as a white person to a black person, it's really, really important that there's a huge amount of self-reflection that is done. So I want to look really quickly at just a few examples of microaggressions. This is a website, by the way, by Kim. You can definitely look up his work. It should be pretty easy to find. It's on his Tumblr. And this is just a few examples of microaggressions. So why do you sound white? You're pretty for a dark-skinned girl. So going back to that idea of colorism or proximity to whiteness, which I spoke about earlier when I was comparing, you know, how my mother's experience, because she is darker skinned to me, compared to my experience of the world and the way people see me might be different. Also here is, you know, no, where are you really from? So people not being able to see you as being a citizen based on your ethnicity. When people think it's weird that I listen to Carrie Underwood, I believe Carrie Underwood is a country singer. You know, what are you? So this woman is biracial or mixed heritage. You don't act like a normal black person. So this very monolithic idea of what blackness is supposed to be. You're not really Asian. So what does your hair look like? And as this lady says here, or this woman says here, I'm identifying her, so as this person says, she said as she pulled off my hat without my permission. So why do microaggressions hurt? Microaggressions hurt because they homogenize, they other, they exclude, they alienate, they stereotype. There's a lack of ownership. So going back to that last, you know, quote that I just read out, you know, somebody decided to touch somebody else without their permission. This idea of owning a black person, you know, I think, you know, there's, if you were to unpack that, I think that's what it says. And then a lack of authorship as well. So authorship is not having the ability to tell your own story, someone else being the authoritarian of your story.